You think this cabin is yours? He sneered, lost billionaire turned intruder. But her silence burned hotter than the fire. She didn't flinch, didn't yield. And when the snow buried the road behind him, he realized he wasn't trapped by the storm. He was trapped by the truth she carried. Stay with us. Because every voice they tried to silence deserves to be heard. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments. Have you ever rewritten your own story? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Black Stories Untold with love, and ring that notification bell for more heartwarming stories that celebrate strength. The wind screamed across the Alaskan wilderness, swallowing every trace of the sky. Snow fell in thick, merciless sheets, erasing the horizon until the world turned white and soundless. Somewhere in that chaos, headlights carved through the storm, trembling against the coal. The sleek black SUV crawled along a half-buried road before sliding to a stop. The man inside exhaled a sharp cloud of breath, his jaw tight, his knuckles pale against the steering wheel. Rowan Scott, billionaire, exile, the kind of man who once thought the world bent to his schedule, now stranded at the mercy of something bigger than himself. He stepped out into the storm, and the wind punched him hard, stealing his breath. The cold was not the kind that bit, it devoured. His coat whipped behind him, tailored cashmere meeting wilderness that did not care who wore it. The blizzard howled like a living thing, furious and alive, until a faint yellow light flickered in the distance. A cabin, small, lonely, and glowing faintly against the dark. He pushed through the snow, each step a struggle, his body trembling from exhaustion and disbelief. He had meant to land near a luxury lodge on the coast where privacy could be bought and silence poured like expensive wine. But the storm had turned technology into guesswork, and the wrong turn had left him here. When he finally reached the door, he didn't knock. He simply pushed it open. Warmth rushed toward him, carrying the scent of wood smoke and something else. Lavender, maybe, or memory. The sound of crackling fire filled the small space, and for a moment it was enough to make his shoulders drop. Then he saw her. Jennifer Taylor sat cross-legged near the hearth, her dark skin glowing softly in the firelight, her curls gathered loosely at the nape of her neck. A thick blanket draped over her shoulders, and in her hands she held a steaming mug that rose in slow curls of heat. The shock on her face gave way to something sharper, steadier. Not fear, not awe, just the cool clarity of a woman who had no reason to be impressed. Rowan stood at the threshold, snow clinging to his hair, his breath uneven. He looked out of place against the warmth of the room, like a photograph cut from another world. She studied him in silence, her eyes dark and unblinking, the kind of gaze that stripped a man of titles before he had a chance to speak. For a long moment, neither moved. Only the storm filled the silence, beating against the cabin walls like 1,000 fists. Rowan's mind raced with the logic of ownership and control. He was used to commanding rooms, not asking for permission to enter them. But something about the way she sat there, grounded, unyielding, wholly herself, made the words stick in his throat. He glanced around the space. It was simple, but alive. Books stacked near the bed. A typewriter resting on a small wooden table. A single window fogged from the heat inside. Every inch of it looked touched by intention, by care. The kind of life that existed without need for anyone's validation. Outside, the snow buried the world deeper in silence. Inside, the air tightened between them, an invisible thread stretching across the room. Two strangers from opposite worlds, forced together by accident or fate. He had come here to disappear. She had come here to be found by no one. Yet, in that moment, as the firelight danced across their faces, both understood that the storm had not made a mistake. It had simply rewritten the map. The fire snapped between them, scattering sparks that flared and vanished before they touched the floor. Rowan stood near the door, his shoulders rigid, his breath still uneven from the storm. Water dripped from his coat onto the wood, each drop marking his intrusion. His voice, when it came, was smooth but sharp, the kind of tone that had once commanded rooms filled with people who depended on his approval. He asked for warmth, food, and silence, as if the cabin and the woman inside it existed for his comfort. Jennifer did not move. She sat near the hearth, her expression calm but unyielding. The rhythm of the storm pounded against the walls, a steady reminder that the world outside had closed in. Her hand tightened around her mug as she studied him, the expensive coat, the restless eyes, the invisible weight of a man unaccustomed to hearing no. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and low. It carried the grounded patience of someone who had learned long ago that anger only fed arrogance. Rowan's posture faltered. He was not used to being met with stillness instead of submission. He looked around again, searching for control in a place where he had none. The wind wailed through the chimney. The fire hissed. Between them, the silence thickened until it felt alive. Rowan accused her of occupying the cabin illegally, his words crisp, almost rehearsed. Jennifer tilted her head slightly, a quiet smile touching her lips, not the kind that softened, but the kind that mirrored disbelief. Her laughter rose softly above the storm, not cruel, but certain. It landed in the air like truth, reminding him that his power meant nothing here. He stepped closer to the fire, the heat drawing color back to his face. His presence filled the room in the way cities fill silence, with noise that pretends to be meaning. She watched him, her eyes steady, refusing to flinch. For years she had written about men like him, men who mistook control for strength. But seeing it up close was different. It was almost tragic, the way he held on to his composure as if it were a lifeline. The storm outside grew louder, wrapping the cabin in its relentless howl. Rowan's arrogance began to wane, chipped away by exhaustion and cold. Jennifer rose quietly, took a second blanket from the corner, and placed it near the fire without a word. It was not forgiveness. It was decency. He accepted it without thanks, but something in his eyes softened when their gazes met again. As the hours stretched on, the wind became their clock. They shared the same silence, both pretending not to notice how it had changed. He stared into the fire like a man trying to burn his past away. She opened her notebook, pen resting between her fingers, though no words came. By nightfall, the lines between them had blurred. Two strangers bound by circumstance, each carrying a loneliness too heavy to name. The storm had trapped them, but it had also stripped them down to something bare and honest. He no longer looked like a billionaire. She no longer looked like solitude. The fire glowed between them, steady and alive, holding their distance and their connection in equal measure. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, something quieter began to stir. Something neither of them had planned, yet both somehow recognized. The morning came slow, the kind of light that crept rather than arrived. Frost melted down the cabin windows in trembling rivers, and the storm had softened into silence. Rowan sat near the fire, his coat folded beside him, his face unshaven, his eyes rimmed in exhaustion. The glow of the flames flickered against his skin, tracing lines that wealth could never erase. For the first time, he looked like what he truly was: tired, displaced, undone. Jennifer stirred quietly behind him, wrapping her blanket tighter around her shoulders. The night had carved something unspoken between them, not closeness, but a strange awareness. She had seen the shift in him as the fire burned low, the way his arrogance thinned into uncertainty, the way his hands shook when he thought she wasn't looking. Now, in the fragile light of morning, he seemed smaller, human. Outside, the trees bowed under the weight of the storm's memory. Inside, Rowan's thoughts circled like restless birds. His empire had crumbled in a matter of weeks. The company he built, the power he worshipped, the woman he trusted, all gone, leaving only the echo of headlines that called him ruthless, reckless, broken. He had fled to this frozen edge of the world to escape the noise. But solitude had a way of amplifying what he most wanted to silence. Jennifer watched him from her place by the table. She did not speak. There was no sympathy in her gaze, only understanding. She recognized the shape of collapse when she saw it. She had lived it. The day she exposed the truth about the publishing house she worked for. The bias, the silencing, the deliberate exclusion. She lost everything. Her colleagues called her brave in whispers, but vanished when she needed their voices. Her words, once her power, became her exile. The two of them sat in the small cabin, 2 stories of ruin told in silence. The fire hissed as a log collapsed into embers. Rowan rubbed his palms together, the sound harsh in the quiet. His posture spoke of habit, of a man who had spent his life filling spaces with motion because stillness made him uneasy. But the wilderness had stripped him of pretense. There was nowhere left to perform. Jennifer turned back to her notebook. The pages were filled with half-written sentences, fragments of a novel she no longer knew how to finish. Each line carried the echo of something she had once believed in, a better world, a fairer one. But even now, the words trembled under the weight of what they cost her. She had told the truth and lost the stage to tell it on. For a long time, the only sound was the fire. Then Rowan exhaled, long and low, as if releasing something heavy. She didn't look up, but she heard it, the sound of a man cracking open beneath the silence. And though she did not move toward him, the air shifted. The cabin, small and weathered, felt different now, not like a refuge, but like a mirror. 2 people, each cast out for opposite reasons, one for taking too much, the other for giving too much, sitting in the aftermath of their choices. Outside, the snow began to fall again, gentler this time, like forgiveness learning how to speak. The storm returned that night with a fury that shook the cabin walls. Wind clawed at the windows, snow battered the roof, and the fire fought to hold its light against the dark. Inside, Jennifer and Rowan sat in its glow, the room wrapped in warmth and flickering gold. The storm outside roared like the world they had both tried to escape, but inside, the noise softened. It became something else, something almost holy. Jennifer's notebook lay open beside her, ink smudged from restless hands. She had stopped writing hours ago. Instead, she spoke softly, the way one speaks when the world has been stripped away and there is nothing left but truth. She told him that words were the first thing she ever loved, that they could build or destroy, heal or wound, but always reveal. Her voice carried no bitterness, only the calm certainty of someone who had lived through the sharp edge of language and survived it. Rowan listened with a stillness that surprised even him. He had spent his life turning language into leverage, shaping words into contracts and commands. Yet here, in the fire's low light, every word from her mouth felt heavier than anything he had ever signed. He looked at her and saw not just a woman, but a mirror, one that reflected everything he had spent years avoiding. She spoke of her father, who told her stories under the stars when the power went out. She spoke of the day she realized that stories could be weapons too, used to erase or to elevate. The publishing house had wanted her to write about resilience, not resistance, about hope, but not justice. She refused. And the silence that followed had cost her everything. Rowan felt the sting of recognition. He thought of the boardrooms where his voice had been gospel, the people who had called him visionary while they swallowed their resentment. He had built his empire from control, convinced that success justified the loneliness it left behind. But as the firelight danced across her face, he began to see the emptiness in his victories. He had spoken endlessly, yet never truly said anything that mattered. The storm howled louder, but neither moved. The power flickered, the lights dimmed, and then the cabin fell into darkness. Only the fire remained, steady and alive. In that small circle of light, they were stripped of pretense. No fortune, no scandal, no audience. Just two people breathing in rhythm with the storm. Rowan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. He told her in a quiet voice that he had spent years mistaking ambition for purpose, that every empire he built felt smaller once he reached the top. Jennifer said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence was not judgment, it was space, the kind that lets a confession breathe. The wind softened, the fire crackled. Between them stretched a silence that felt sacred, as if the world itself had paused to listen. The flames painted their faces in gold and shadow, two lives marked by very different scars but bound now by the same truth. That power means nothing without purpose. That survival without honesty is another kind of death. When Rowan finally looked up, the firelight caught the reflection of tears he hadn't noticed. He smiled faintly, almost grateful. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, something else had begun to calm. The fire burned lower that night, its glow turning from gold to amber, its warmth trembling in the quiet. Outside, the storm had thinned to a whisper, a tired wind brushing snow from the trees. Inside, the silence pressed close. Rowan sat across from Jennifer, his hands clasped, his gaze fixed on the dying flames as though they could tell him what to say. He had carried his story like armor for so long that removing it felt like walking into cold air, unprotected. He began to speak. Slowly, carefully, each word dropped like a stone into still water. He told her his name, his real name, the one that filled headlines and stock tickers, the man who once ruled boardrooms and traded empathy for efficiency, the man whose empire fell under the weight of his own ambition. His voice wavered when he said it aloud, as if even he no longer believed in that version of himself. Jennifer did not react. She did not gasp or pull back. She simply watched him, her expression unreadable, her calm both unnerving and kind. He waited for judgment, the same sharp look he had seen in journalists, investors, strangers on the street. But it did not come. Only her stillness remained, steady and unbroken. When she finally spoke, her words were soft but piercing. She asked him who he was before the world started calling him by his title. The question hung in the air, heavier than accusation. Rowan opened his mouth, but no sound came. He searched his memory, sifting through years of noise, of meetings and headlines, of hands shaken out of obligation rather than trust. He could recall the smell of jet fuel, the glare of stage lights, the applause that once felt like love, but not himself. He looked down at his hands, realizing they had built everything except meaning. The silence between them deepened. The fire popped softly, casting a brief spark that faded as quickly as it came. Jennifer's gaze did not waver. She seemed to see through him, not with cruelty, but with clarity, the kind that stripped away pretense and left only truth. She told him that power without purpose is just noise, that some people build kingdoms to be remembered, while others build bridges to matter. Her voice was calm, without accusation, but it reached inside him with the quiet precision of truth. He felt something in his chest tighten, not in shame, but in recognition. For the first time in years, Rowan listened without rehearsing his next defense. He listened as if his life depended on it. The room felt smaller now, not in confinement, but in intimacy. Two souls sitting in the same light, one learning, the other reminding. The wind outside sighed against the walls, but the storm within him began to still. Jennifer leaned back, her eyes reflecting the firelight, her breath steady. She had no intention of saving him. She simply refused to let him lie to himself. That, he realized, was the difference between judgment and truth. When he finally looked at her again, something in his face had changed. The mask had cracked, not in defeat, but in surrender. The kind that makes space for rebuilding. The flames flickered, soft and low, painting him not as a fallen man, but as one finally unmasked. Snow covered the world in silence. Each morning the cabin woke in soft light, the kind that blurred edges and made even sorrow look gentle. The days followed a rhythm that neither of them planned but both accepted. Rowan chopped wood in the early hours, his breath rising in clouds against the air. Jennifer brewed coffee on the stove, the scent filling the small room like a promise of calm. They spoke little, but their silence was not empty. It was the kind that carried understanding without demand. The storm had buried the roads. The world beyond the cabin might as well have been another planet. At first, Rowan fought the stillness, checking his phone even when it had no signal, glancing toward the window as if the horizon might return his old life. But as the snow deepened, the urgency drained out of him. There was no empire to manage here, no one to impress. Only the hum of the fire, the scrape of a pen against paper, and the soft murmur of Jennifer's voice as she read her own words aloud. Her manuscript was rough, ink smudged by hands that had wrestled with truth. She read without performance, her voice steady and unpolished. It was a story of loss and rebuilding, of a woman standing in the ruins of what she once believed and learning to trust the sound of her own voice again. Rowan listened as if the words belonged to him too. They struck a chord he had buried under years of noise. Each sentence peeled away another layer of the man he used to be, until all that remained was the question of who he might become. When she paused, he told her the story was powerful, that the world needed to hear it. He offered to help her publish it once they left this frozen exile. But Jennifer's gaze stopped him cold. Her eyes held no gratitude, only quiet strength. She told him she did not need his money or his influence. She needed her story to be hers. What she wanted from him was not help, it was honesty. The words unsettled him more than rejection. They forced him to see the difference between generosity and control, between giving and keeping someone indebted. For the first time, he understood that all his life he had been trying to buy forgiveness for the emptiness inside him. Her refusal left him without a transaction to hide behind. It left only truth. That night, after she had gone to sleep, Rowan sat at the table with a candle flickering beside him. He opened an old leather notebook from his coat pocket, its pages blank since the fall of his company. The pen felt heavy in his hand. He began to write, not about business or success, but about loss, fear, and the fragile beauty of being seen without armor. The words came slow, uncertain at first, but then steady. The cabin had become a mirror. In the quiet, surrounded by snow and truth, Rowan finally faced the reflection he had spent years avoiding. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying no sound of rescue, no promise of return. Inside, two souls sat in the small circle of firelight, learning that sometimes isolation is not punishment but rebirth. The world returned in fragments, the roar of engines, the hum of blades slicing through thin air. The storm had finally lifted, revealing a sky so pale it looked washed clean. For days there had been only silence and snow, but now the sound of rescue filled the valley like a promise and a warning all at once. Rowan stood at the window, his reflection framed by frost, watching the dark shapes of helicopters growing larger against the horizon. The world that had forgotten him was coming back, and it had found him again. Behind him, Jennifer folded her few belongings into a canvas bag. Each motion was careful, almost ritualistic, as if she were packing away not just her things, but the quiet they had shared. The cabin that had once been a refuge now felt like a place already fading into memory. The fire burned low, and the air between them felt different, heavy with what had been said and with what never would be. Outside, voices shouted through the trees. The crunch of boots on snow echoed closer. The search party had reached the edge of their world. Rowan turned from the window, his voice trembling with something between gratitude and fear. He told her they would take her with them, that there was room, that after all this they could build something new together. The words came out raw, stripped of pride. For the first time in his life, he was not offering, but asking. Jennifer tightened the strap of her bag and looked at him with a tenderness that made the air ache. Her eyes were steady, unhurried, the kind that saw the truth before it was spoken. She stepped closer, and for a moment he thought she might stay. But her voice was soft when she spoke, and it carried the kind of peace that could not be bargained with. Some stories, she said, are not meant to be owned, only remembered. The sound of the approaching rescue grew louder, filling the small cabin until it seemed to shake the walls. Rowan felt the panic rise in him, the instinct to hold on to something slipping away. But Jennifer's calm was absolute. She brushed a strand of hair from her face, her hand steady, her breath even. Then she smiled, the kind of smile that closes one life and opens another. She stepped outside into the blinding light. The snow crunched softly beneath her boots, each footprint pressed deep into the earth. She did not look back. The wind caught her coat, lifting it like a wing. Rowan stood in the doorway, the sound of rescue behind him and the sight of her fading ahead. The helicopters landed, engines cutting through the quiet, but all he heard was the rhythm of her footsteps disappearing into the white. Her trail stretched across the frozen ground like punctuation marks at the end of a story he wasn't ready to finish. When the rescuers reached him, their voices blurred into noise. Cameras clicked, questions rose, hands reached to pull him away. But Rowan stayed still for a moment longer, watching the place where she vanished. The woman who had found him without trying, who had seen through the storm and the silence, was gone. And though the world had come to save him, it was she who had set him free. The city greeted him not with warmth, but with noise. Car horns, flashing lights, voices rising and falling like waves against glass. Rowan stepped out of the black car into a wall of sound, the rhythm of cameras clicking like rain on pavement. The world that once crowned him now circled him with curiosity. Questions shouted, hands reached. He moved through them in silence, his face calm, his stride measured. To them he was the billionaire who had vanished and returned reborn. To himself he was a man learning how to breathe again. In the boardrooms where he once ruled, everything looked the same: polished marble, chrome reflections, the faint scent of ambition masked as aftershave. Yet he felt the distance between himself and that life as if an ocean stretched across the conference table. The men around him spoke in numbers, projections, strategy. He listened, but their words felt weightless. Power no longer sounded the same to him. It carried no pulse, no life. He had lived through silence, and now the noise of the city felt like static. Reporters called his return a redemption arc. Investors framed it as reputation repair. But when Rowan spoke publicly for the first time, his voice carried none of the sharp precision that once defined him. It was slower, heavier, more human. He told them he had learned something about loss, about what remains when everything else is stripped away. They clapped politely, missing the truth hidden beneath the simplicity. A month later, he founded something new, not another empire, but a beginning. a foundation dedicated to amplifying voices like Jennifer's, Black women writers whose stories the world too often silenced or softened. He named it after a line from her unfinished manuscript, the one that had kept him awake in that snowbound cabin. The words became its name, Quiet Fire. The press wrote their own version of the story. They called it philanthropy. They called it reinvention. They said the billionaire had found a way to polish his legacy after scandal, but none of them knew that every check he signed carried her memory. Each grant awarded was his quiet apology for a world that had ignored women like her for too long. At night, when the city lights bled into the clouds and the skyline pulsed with its endless hunger, Rowan stood by the glass wall of his penthouse. Below him, the streets glittered with movement, alive with everything he once believed mattered. Yet it all felt distant, unreal. He kept his gaze on the horizon where the world turned pale in winter. In his mind, the snow never stopped falling. He thought of Jennifer's last words before she disappeared into the white. Some stories are not meant to be owned, only remembered. He understood now. Her story was not his to claim, but it had become the compass guiding him through the noise. He placed a hand against the glass, the city lights reflecting in his eyes like fading stars. Outside, snow began to fall, quiet and relentless, covering the noise for a moment. And in that silence, he found the only truth that mattered. She had not saved him. She had reminded him how to save himself. The bookstore was alive with murmurs and light, the kind of warmth that came not from the lamps, but from people gathered close. Shelves glowed under soft amber bulbs, every surface lined with copies of a single book, The Quiet Between Storms. Jennifer's name shimmered in gold across the cover, elegant and sure. The air carried that electric mix of pride and stillness that only truth can bring. It smelled of ink and paper and something new being born. Jennifer stood at the front, calm beneath the gaze of strangers who had come to hear her words. Her dress was simple, deep green that caught the light when she moved. The years she had carried in silence now lived on the pages before her, turned into sentences that belonged to the world. She thanked the crowd, her voice low and steady, then began to read. Each word floated through the air like falling snow. Her story was not loud or dramatic. It moved with quiet force, unraveling pain and rebuilding it into grace. She read about love that did not ask for ownership, about forgiveness that did not erase the wound. People listened, unmoving, caught in the rhythm of her truth. For a moment, the room became the cabin again, filled with firelight and stillness. Near the back, half hidden beneath a dark cap, Rowan stood among the crowd. No cameras, no entourage, just a man in silence. He held a copy of the book in his hand, the cover warm from the press of his palm. He had already read it, every line, every pause. He had stopped when he reached the dedication and sat for a long time without breathing. For the man who entered my cabin and left me with peace. Now, hearing her voice fill the room, he felt that same peace again, raw and alive. His chest tightened, not with regret, but with something softer. Gratitude, maybe, or recognition. She had written him into the world not as a savior or a villain, but as a man who had learned how to listen. When she looked up from the page, her gaze swept the crowd. For a heartbeat, her eyes found his. The room seemed to fall away, the noise dissolving into silence. They did not smile. They did not move. It was not the kind of moment that demanded words. It was an acknowledgement, quiet and complete. The space between them was full, not empty. She continued reading. He listened. The story had moved on, and so had they. But the thread that bound them had not frayed. It had simply become invisible, woven into the fabric of who they were. When the applause came, Rowan slipped out quietly into the cool evening. The city hummed around him, alive and endless. He opened the book again, tracing her name with his thumb. Somewhere behind him, laughter and light spilled from the store, but he walked into the night with a calm that felt like truth. Two souls had collided once in the middle of a storm. They had not stayed together, but they had left each other changed. And sometimes, he thought, that was the purest form of love the world could hold. The road back to Alaska was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt sacred. The mountains rose in solemn grace, their peaks wrapped in mist, their silence older than any man's name. Rowan drove alone, the hum of the engine the only sound between him and the wilderness. A year had passed since the storm, since the cabin, since the moment that split his life into before and after. He had built foundations, made speeches, and given his fortune a new purpose. But part of him had remained here, buried somewhere in the snow. When he reached the clearing, the world looked untouched. The trees still bowed under the weight of winter. The wind still whispered through the pines. And there it was. The cabin, standing firm against the cold, its roof layered with snow, its windows clouded with time. He stepped out of the car, his boots sinking deep into the earth, the sound muffled by the endless white. The air smelled of pine and memory. He pushed open the door. The hinges groaned softly, like an old friend waking from sleep. The inside was smaller than he remembered, yet every inch of it breathed with familiarity. The wood still held the faint scent of smoke. The same books sat on the shelf, their spines worn from touch. On the table rested an empty mug, one he could have sworn she left there. He crossed the room slowly, fingertips brushing across the grain of the wood, the surface etched with scratches that spoke of living, not time. He knelt near the hearth. The firewood was gone, but when he reached beneath the stones, his fingers brushed against paper. A folded note, fragile with age. He opened it carefully. The handwriting was hers, elegant and unhurried. Sometimes the wrong turn leads you home. For a long while, he said nothing. The words settled into him like light through snow. He smiled then, the kind of smile that comes from the place between sorrow and grace. He gathered wood, struck a match, and watched the fire bloom back to life. Its glow filled the cabin, painting the walls in gold and shadow. The warmth wrapped around him, and for the first time in a long time, he did not feel alone. He sat by the fire until the light blurred his eyes, the flames reflecting all that he had lost and all that he had found. The silence held him gently. He thought of Jennifer, of her voice reading by firelight, of her laughter in the storm, of the peace she had given without asking for anything in return. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and endless. The world faded into white, the wind carrying whispers through the trees. Footprints disappeared one by one, erased by the storm's quiet grace. But inside, the fire burned steady, a small pulse of warmth in the vast cold. The camera drifted back through the snowfall, framing the cabin against the darkening forest. Its windows glowed faintly through the storm, a single light standing in the silence. A place where two strangers once met and found something larger than themselves. A truth, small and infinite, flickering against the endless white. Before you move on, take a second to pass this forward. Someone out there is standing in the snow, trying to find their own light again. Share this story, and remind them that even the coldest storms can lead you home. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, drop a comment, and share it with a friend. And don't forget to subscribe to Black Stories Untold for more stories that uncover hidden struggles, celebrate strength, and remind us that every voice matters.